We promised that we will have a panel on Turkish policy on Ukraine, because we had an ample amount of questions in that panel on Turkey's policy. But there was also an upcoming visit by President Erdogan to Ukraine. And following that trip and following a lot of articles written on this topic, we decided to have this panel, and we have today three distinguished panelists discussing Turkey's policy on Ukrainian crisis. I don't want to go in depth in introducing our panelists. Just Jeffrey Mankoff is Distinguished Research Fellow, Institute for National Strategic Studies at National Defense University. Yevgenia Gaber, Senior Fellow, Center in Modern Turkish Studies at Carleton University. One of our young scholars on Turkey fellows from a long time ago. And Kadir Üstün, Executive Director at SETA Foundation. Yevgenia, shall we start with you and how in Kyiv it is being seen, perceived as Turkey's policy on Ukraine since the beginning of the crisis?
Well, yeah, sure. And thank you for hosting me here and for organizing the panel, because the Russia crisis, and I would tend to still call it a Russia crisis, not a Ukraine crisis, since the origin of the crisis is definitely not in Kyiv, but rather in Moscow. So that's something that is spoken and discussed on all different panels and platforms, but not really everyone gets the grasp of how it is seen from the Ukrainian side and also from the perspective of Ukrainian-Turkish relations. I would start with the example rather than with general formulas and some kind of concepts. Just look at what we are having now. Recent days, all of the experts have written about the Russian vessels coming into the Black Sea. So that's not a secret, I believe, for any of us or those who are listening to us, that now we have 6 landing ships, Russian ships of the Baltic and the Nordic navies coming through the straits and into the Black Sea to be based in Crimea, which is now under the occupation of Russia. That in itself is a huge dilemma for Turkey, because it poses so many questions at one time. What is the security implications? What can be the security implications of this change in naval balance in the Black Sea for Turkey? What does it mean for a broader region, not only for Crimea, because we understand very well that Crimea is a very nice power projection into the Mediterranean. And further, what does it mean in terms of Montreux Convention? Will it somehow change position of Turkey on the Montreux Convention? Will the straits or can the straits be closed or not in case of the further militarization of the Black Sea? If the response from NATO follows, will Turkey allow more of NATO warships of the non-littoral states into the Black Sea? And if yes, under which pretext, and what does it mean for the future of the Montreux Convention? So on and so forth. So basically everything which happens now in Ukraine and around Ukraine is crucially important for Turkey, and security of Ukraine is crucially important for the security of Turkey itself, because it means that the general status quo, and Turkey, as far as I can see it, mostly tends to support the existing very fragile balance, but still existing status quo in the region, it is changing. So you have to respond somehow to that, either you want it or not. The policy of soft balancing in between Ukraine and Russia, NATO and Russia, which Turkish regional policy is famous for, cannot be maintained anymore once you have this growing military buildup of Russia, amassing troops on the borders of Ukraine and also in Belarus and elsewhere. And all these changes provoked by Russia, they also create so many difficult choices and so many foreign policy dilemmas for Turkey that I believe after Ukraine, Turkey might be the second country which is the most cautious and the most worries about what is going on here in the region. So to put it shortly, I would say that there are 3 main points where Turkey cares about this situation, and 3 main points which define Turkey's policies here in the region. First is, as I said, maintaining balance between Russia and Ukraine, and these working relations with Russia, at the same time having strategic partnership with Ukraine. I mean, officially, Turkey has both strategic partnerships with Russia and Ukraine, but the level of those relations, and I would also argue the level of trust to the leadership of Russia and Ukraine are a bit different. So I believe we have much closer ties now between Ukraine and Turkey rather than Turkey has with Russia. But still, it's not always that you can have this compartmentalization in place, which is very famous in Turkey. So you can agree to disagree, and on some points, on some tracks, you can develop economic cooperation with Russia, for example, but on the other, you are on different sides of the barricades and supporting different forces, let's say in Crimea, because Turkey does not recognize the illegal occupation and annexation in Georgia, in Libya, in Syria, in many other regional conflicts. But still, you could, until recently, Turkey could develop those relations with Russia. If there is an open conflict between Ukraine and Russia, it will be really difficult not to take any side and still to be somewhere in between. Second is about deterring Russia and containment of Russia in this region without escalation. And that's, I would argue, another very important principled position of official Ankara. So on the one hand, we know there is this strategic cooperation on a number of issues like S-400 and Akkuyu and some kind of Turk Stream and so on. But still, historically and strategically, Ankara and Moscow remain rivals. So it's important for Turkey to create and to maintain this balance, as far as I can see it. On the one hand, not having more of NATO, non-literal states, NATO members in the region, but on the other hand, to contain, to deter Russia. And for that, Ukraine was a perfect choice. So helping Ukraine, developing capacities, defense capacities of Ukraine as well. What Turkey did, it was strengthening Ukraine in order to actually deter a bit, contain Russia, not going into direct confrontation with Russia. Now, again, if something happens to Ukraine, if there is another occupation, if Ukraine as a state, and I don't want even to pronounce that, but kind of ceases to exist, that is huge security challenge for Turkey, which remains one-on-one with Russia, which is getting more and more assertive and aggressive. And third point, which is also important here, is defense cooperation, defense industry. I mean, this is something that was discussed during the recent visit of President Erdogan to Ukraine. And this is something that we have been witnessing for many months, like 3 years, 4 years, I would say, starting with the combat drones. And that's not only about commercial deals of buying those drones, but actually now we're talking about joint production of them in Ukraine. And President Erdogan was crystal clear saying that this cooperation will go on whether Russia wants it or not. So it's not anti-Russian, but still it does not depend on the Russian desire to see or not to see this cooperation coming and developing. But it's not only about that. It's also about Milgem project, which is a national project of the ship, right, of the vessel, which is now in Turkey. We have one of those vessels being built for Ukraine, so we hope to get it soon. We can also speak about some kind of attack helicopter, so on and so forth. So that's important both for Ukraine and for Turkey in terms of defense and in terms of cooperation. There is also another track, which is a NATO track. I will not go into detail there. We can discuss it later. But last point I will make here, and I will stop, is that Ukraine is not only Ukraine for Turkey. Ukraine for Turkey is also another door or window of opportunity to be constructive, to play a constructive role within the NATO framework. So if you look at the news feeds of Turkish newspapers and media after President Erdogan's visit to Ukraine, first it was about the direct results and conclusions of the visit. And then the second part was about phone conversations between Foreign Minister Çavuşoğlu and State Secretary Blinken about the Stoltenberg's statement that he praised the mediation initiatives of President Erdogan, so on and so forth. So basically having some problems in relations between Turkey and NATO, I believe that this situation around Ukraine also also creates opportunity to foster that cooperation, to play a constructive role here, and also to be within this framework of regional ownership approach, but at the same time to have these transatlantic links strengthened as well. I will stop here, but I mean, we can discuss many different issues, including mediation initiatives and all these things later in the question and answer part. Thank you.
Thank you. Jeff, how the Turkish policy is seen in Washington, D.C. And we have seen a revival of the geopolitics of Turkey debate in the last couple of weeks since the beginning of the Ukrainian crisis. And a joint friend of us reminded me a sentence that is usually attributed to Mark Twain. It says, God created war so that Americans would learn geography. So are they re-understanding the geopolitics in the region and the significance of Turkey in this crisis?
Thanks very much, Kilic, and thanks to SETA for hosting this panel. So it's unfortunate that it takes war to teach Americans about geography, but sometimes I think that Mark Twain was probably right in that regard. As far as the U.S. approach and the U.S. Understanding of Turkey's dealings in this crisis, I do think that there is a greater appreciation for the role that a country like Turkey can play, both based on its geographic position and on the kind of relationships that it's forged with the different players in the region. I think it's worth keeping in mind that we're coming out of a period in which there were very serious U.S.-Turkish tensions that extended over a wide range of issues connected to the conflict in Syria, connected to domestic politics, and the like. And some of the difficulty that Turkey faces in official Washington are still there. But they've been increasingly subsumed following the push for greater diplomatic rapprochement between President Biden and President Erdogan going back to the NATO summit last year, but also because now of developments in and around Ukraine, where I do think that there is an appreciation for the role that Turkey can play both on the fronts of deterrence and diplomacy. At the same time, there are concerns about how Turkey's cooperation with Ukraine on a bilateral basis can potentially create problems for NATO if it does end up being perceived by Russia as overly provocative, and if it becomes one of the grounds for Russia to increase its pressure on Ukraine or to carry out military operations. And we saw this with the Ukrainian army's use of the Turkish drones in an attack against the separatist-held positions. I guess it was about 2 months ago, but was one of the things that in the Russian press and in the Russian analytic community was cited as being behind the ongoing buildup of Russian forces around the Ukrainian border and some of the rethinking within Russia itself about the costs and benefits of further escalating the conflict in Ukraine. And because Turkey is a NATO member, there is concern in Washington that if Russia decides to retaliate in some capacity in a way that implicates Turkey or Turkish interests, that of course creates obligations for NATO and for the United States that they're going to have to fulfill. And that's a source of concern. At the same time, I think that the United States and the Biden administration in particular is appreciative of the role Turkey is playing in providing military support for Ukraine at a time when there's not real consensus within the alliance, and when you have some allies like Germany that are continuing to be very cautious about what they're willing to do on a bilateral basis, and even in terms of facilitating multilateral NATO support for Ukraine. So there have been a small number of NATO allies, that have engaged in direct military sales to Ukraine over the last several months. The US is in the forefront of that effort, but along with the UK and Turkey. These are the big suppliers of new weaponry to the Ukrainian military, which is at the end of the day not going to allow Ukraine to win if there's a large-scale war, but is certainly going to change the balance of power enough that hopefully it'll affect the way that Russia thinks about the possibilities of success and the potential casualties that it would face were it to choose to further escalate the conflict. And I think in that sense, it's a reminder that Turkey is, after the United States, one of the major military powers in NATO, and because of its geography, that it covers a wide region of the world that is of strategic concern to the United States and to NATO. I think this has implications on the energy front as well, because again, energy pipelines are one of the things that are being mixed up in the current crisis, and Russia has threatened to cut off the supply of gas to European customers across Ukraine as part of its campaign to get support for Nord Stream 2. If the Nord Stream 2 pipeline ends up getting mothballed in response to Russia's military pressure against Ukraine, and Russia makes the decision not to, or to downgrade the flows of gas through the pipelines across Ukraine, then the pipelines that go through Turkey are going to take on a larger importance, and the ability to move oil and gas, I guess oil in particular, across the Black Sea is going to be important as well. So for all of these reasons, I think there's an appreciation in Washington of the role that Turkey can play, that's coupled with some concern that Turkey's actions may, if not coordinated with the other NATO allies, potentially create some problems down the road. And I should say too that because Turkey has this very complicated relationship with Russia, I don't remember exactly how Yevgenia phrased it, but I remember thinking that it was a very apt way of putting it, that it's not engaged with Russia in a competitive relationship only in Ukraine, but it has this range of regional competitions that extends to Libya, Syria, the South Caucasus, and elsewhere. And I think one area where there hasn't been as much sort of critical thinking on this, at least in Washington, is how an escalation of the conflict in Ukraine could affect the Russo-Turkish balance in any of these other theaters. There's been an upsurge in violence in Idlib recently. I think there's still concern that this could be used as a pressure point by the Russians should they want to put pressure on Turkey over Turkish actions in Ukraine. And that also, of course, has implications for Turkey's own security and stability, but also for the United States, given the role that it has played throughout in the Syrian conflict and the efforts that it's continuing to undertake to try and maintain at least a modicum of stability in the region. So Turkey is taking on an incredibly significant role in this scenario, in this situation. It's one where I think it is contributing to the broader improvement of U.S.-Turkish relations that's been underway over the course of the last 6 months to maybe a little bit more than that. But it also holds some potential challenges going forward. And I think depending on what Russia's ultimate aims in this conflict are and how the tensions around Ukraine's borders end up developing, the implications for the U.S.-Turkish relationship could go in a couple of different directions. And of course, we'll be watching how that develops very closely.
Thank you, Jeff. And before Kadir, I just want to announce that if you have any question, please write it down to Q&A box if you are following through Zoom. If you are following through Twitter and Facebook, please write your question to the comment section so that my assistants will gather those questions and submit it to me at the same time. So we want to make it as interactive as possible. Please write down your questions. Start writing down your questions if you have so. And Kadir, Turkey's policy, and you followed closely President Erdogan's visit to Kyiv last week. And what is Turkey's policy? What is Ankara is expecting to happen in this crisis?
Thank you, Kılıç, and thank you, Jeff and Yevgenia. A lot of the things that I wanted to say have been said in terms of Turkey's relationship, the complexities of relationship with Russia, and the extent of the relationship with Ukraine. But I think I should just do a little bit of a bullet point, especially on Ukraine, and say that Turkey never recognized the annexation of Crimea. It continues to call it illegal, and it's kind of vocal about that. Turkey strongly supports NATO membership for Ukraine. Turkey's position is not actually let's see along the way, but it's more like Turkey sees it as an actual asset contribution to NATO's strength, both Georgia and Ukraine. So that's actually a bit of a stronger position than quite a few of the European allies. Turkey's mediation proposal between Zelensky and Putin, that proposal have been repeated, and you know, it's not, Putin accepted to come to Turkey for talks. It's not exactly the acceptance of mediation, but as we all know, Erdogan has a lot of experience talking to Putin, negotiating with Putin over Syria and over, you know, the South Caucasus. So that offer is not just, I think, PR effort, but actually Turkey has some experience on that front. And of course, Turkey's interests are closely tied to stability in the region. Turkey won't benefit from escalation in this conflict because it has strong relations with both countries. There's more competition aspect with Russia, obviously, but not so much with Ukraine. Ukraine does not really compete with Turkey on a number of, especially Middle Eastern issues. And defense ties have been also referred to. That's important. Both countries, Turkey has some sort of defense relationship, but we should also remember that Turkey, in this particular crisis especially, repeatedly mentioned, you know, its NATO obligations. Turkey will stand by them. When it comes to sanctions, countries like Germany and others are hesitant, actually. Even I don't want to compare it as much, but even more hesitant than Turkey. So if Russia were to escalate this situation and actually go for an invasion, or we should say maybe enlargement of the existing invasion, because Crimea is, you know, has been annexed by Russia. So if that were to happen, I'm worried about the unity of NATO, but not because of Turkey, but because of European allies, their stance. I don't know how firm they'll be able to be. If you remember, just last week, sorry, this week, there are so many things happening around Ukraine that we confused. The German chancellor was in Washington, and he kind of avoided, you know, affirming sort of Biden's position that Nord Stream would be canceled or would be stopped if in case of invasion. So the issue is very complex, and you know, Turkey's relationships with both Ukraine and Russia are multi-layered, multi-pronged, I should say. It will find it obviously difficult to manage this in if there is a conflict, a hot conflict, which brings me back to Erdogan's visits and the things he's said. And like Turkey and Ukraine just signed a free trade agreement. That's not a small feat. It's a major thing. I believe bilateral trade is close to $8 billion between Ukraine and Turkey. So Turkey's relationship with Ukraine is not simple. The defense relationship is also deepening. And because of that, we saw Erdogan going there and giving all the support that Ukraine wants in many ways in this particular time period. So we can maybe delve into more, you know, details, but I just feel like Turkish policy on Ukraine is a little underappreciated, and you know, the efforts by Turkey to ensure that, you know, there's no conflict and somehow a diplomatic solution could be found is not very well publicized, perhaps. Yeah, I'll end there, Coach. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have a list of questions, actually. I will start with Jeff, and this is from social media. What is Biden administration planning to do in regards to Germany's position on Ukraine? Do you think would there be any pressure towards Germany through NATO or through bilateral relations?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for the question. I know that Germany's approach to the conflict in Ukraine has been a source of significant bilateral diplomacy. This is not an easy issue for Germany, which has longstanding economic and political ties to Russia, of which the Nord Stream 2 pipeline is just the most recent manifestation. And particularly within the Social Democratic Party of the current Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, there's a tradition of trying to play this sort of mediating role with Russia. And this goes back to the latter stages of the Cold War. That approach is being tested today by the perception of a growing Russian military threat to NATO. And the intervention that Russia has undertaken in the domestic politics of Germany and other NATO allies. You also have a coalition government. The foreign minister in Germany is from the Green Party, which historically has had a much harder line view of Russia. And these tensions are playing out within the German coalition in real time, and it's affecting Berlin's approach to dealing with this crisis. I think in the bilateral context between the Biden administration and the Scholz government, there has been significant discussion of this issue. I think Biden is wary of pressuring Germany, especially in the aftermath of the Trump years, where there's this view in Berlin that the United States saw Germany almost as a rival, as a foe, rather than an important ally. So there's a certain reluctance to be very hard line in terms of dealing with Berlin. But, we did see during the bilateral discussions, the reporting that came out, even though Scholz didn't commit to stopping Nord Stream 2 in his public remarks, the press reporting suggested that he did make that promise during a dinner with American congressional leadership and the president. So it seems that the German government is kind of laying down a marker on this issue, even if it's not so far been willing to commit in public to it. But for the U.S., Germany is a critically important ally, and maintaining and sustaining that relationship after the Trump years, I think, is one of the real priorities of the Biden administration, which is why they have been reluctant to, threaten penalties against Germany or against German companies over Nord Stream. I think they're trying to resolve this through diplomatic channels, and it sounds like they're having some success. But of course, we'll have to wait and see what happens.
Do you think Germany's position can be destabilizing for NATO or impacting the position of other countries in Europe in regards to this crisis?
It's a complication, sure. I think because Germany has been particularly reluctant on the military cooperation side with Ukraine. So the Ukrainian military criticized Germany for providing things like helmets and mattresses rather than lethal equipment. And that, again, I think is a reflection of the political constraints that Germany faces domestically, particularly under a social democratic government. That said, this is an issue within NATO. I know there's been complaints from some of the other allies, including the British, about Germany's reluctance, for instance, to let supply flights that are going to Ukraine cross through German airspace. So, yes, it is a problem. But at the end of the day, I think Germany and the German leadership of any political party understands that Germany's own security is very much bound up in its participation in NATO, and that it's not going to take steps to jeopardize alliance unity. And I think if the conflict with Ukraine does escalate, the position that Scholz has staked out, at least in his private meetings with President Biden and Secretary Blinken and members of the American Congress, suggests that, if things really if worse comes to worst, he will take steps like canceling Nord Stream 2 that the Biden administration and other NATO allies have been pushing him to take.
Thank you. Yevgenia, there's a question by Lasha Takakadze. It says, I have a question regarding Georgia. It's a post-Soviet country like Ukraine, which wants to become member of NATO. What do you think, what should be the Georgian foreign policy towards Ukraine during this crisis?
Well, thank you for the question. I was just lecturing today for the Georgian University, and we had this huge discussion saying that basically there is no other country in the whole world which would understand Ukraine as well as Georgia does, because I mean, we're more or less in the same boat here in the Black Sea. And what we are having now, first Georgia had in 2008 with the Russo-Georgian war back then, and with the occupation of the Georgian territories by Russia. And now we have this, we had this in 2014 when the war started, because this is not something new. I mean, we are in this state of war during 8 years. So now we're just on another new stage of that. So, and also our NATO membership, all different things which we share together, EU ambitions, association trio within the Eastern Partnership, many things that actually connect us. Of course, here in Ukraine, we expected a much more vocal messages of support from Georgia this time. On the official level, of course, we got the diplomatic support, and we get the general statements that de-escalation should be the main focus of the diplomatic efforts, and that we have to proceed with the peaceful and diplomatic means. But speaking on behalf of the expert community, I can say that here, to a large extent, we expected a much more strong wording of the messages which we had from the Georgia as well. But in other regards, what we are doing now, we are mostly doing in coordination with Georgia. There are also calls on combining even Ukrainian case and Georgian case within those files which we now have in international courts, where we appeal for like Russian aggression cases and so on, because those cases are really something which are small parts of the same puzzle. So you cannot get the general regional picture without Georgia or without Ukraine. They're so very much interconnected that a lot what is happening now around Ukraine is the same for Georgia, for Moldova. The same elements are being used as elements of hybrid warfare, starting from information, disinformation, up to cyber attacks, critical infrastructure, and all these kind of things. So in this regard, of course, I mean, we're almost the same. So those messages which we get from Russia now, all those demands for so-called security guarantees for not enlargement of NATO, and actually NATO going back to the borders of 1994 or 7 or whatever. So those are messages also not only for Ukraine, but for Georgia, because basically what Putin wants is the restoration of the Soviet Union. And of course, Georgia and Ukraine would be the first victims to that desire and to those dreams if they happen. But here I would also like to strengthen very shortly another thing, which I think Kadir mentioned, but I also want to pick that up there, that why in Ukraine we appreciate the stance of Turkey that much, because the support which we got from Turkey was something that we got as much as we expected, let's put it this way. Very often in Ukraine, there is kind of a conventional wisdom that you always have these allies whom we appreciate a lot, and those are Baltic states, Poland, Georgia, which understand our situation a lot, and now we have this military support also from the US and UK. But now I believe Turkey is somewhere on the top of the headlines of all Ukrainian youth because of the diplomatic support that we get, because of the drones, of course, and all other kind of military support and equipment, just because this is not only you know, a commercial deal very often. It's about political messages, it's about political stance. And Turkey was basically the first state which was so willing to go into that kind of sensitive cooperation with Ukraine during the first years of war with Russia. So not only now with the escalation at the present moment, but also like 3-4 years ago when we could only dream about some kind of lethal weapons or whatever from other countries. So now that we get really dubious and ambiguous reactions from some EU countries and getting helmets and so on, and hospitals, or whatever we might need in terms of medical aid, the position of Turkey, I would say, very often came as unexpectedly strong on Ukraine. So during the recent polls, I believe among experts, we have this every year. So in December last year, we had Turkey for the first time in top 5 of main allies, major allies of Ukraine in the region, which was for the first time as far as I can remember. Yeah, I mean, basically on Georgia and on Turkey, I would say that those are the 2 major partners here in the Black Sea, which we are discussing and which we appreciate a lot here in Ukraine.
Thank you, Yevgenia. Kadir, Steve Flanagan is asking, there are 2 questions. With regard to the passage of the 6 Russian amphibious ships through the Turkish Straits over the past 2 days, was there any debate in Ankara about invoking Article 21 of the Montreux Convention, which grants Turkey the right to close the straits if it considers itself to be threatened with the imminent danger of war? And second question, do you think the Turkish government will support a more robust NATO deterrent posture in Southeast Europe and the Black Sea if Russia does take further military action against Ukraine?
In terms of Montreux Convention, there is periodic debates in Turkey. This kind of discussion happens. In this particular instance, when Russian ships went through the straits, I don't think much has been discussed, or there wasn't a lot of pressure by the public to close the straits. It's a bit it would be a too strong of a step at this point, because the passage of these ships has been happening for a long time, especially with Russian intervention in Syria, Russian presence, naval presence in the Mediterranean has been happening for years now. So it could be presented as routine. Of course, Russia is doing military exercises in Black Sea. I think that's a tricky thing for Turkey, because Black Sea has been peaceful for a long time, and militarization in the Black Sea is against Turkey's national interests. But I think it would have been too strong of a step at this point to block Russian ships from traversing through the straits at this point, especially when there's no, like the question mentions, there's no conflict at this point. And Turkey always reserves that right. And there are occasional discussions about this, of course. But I think it is more reserved for, let's say, more extreme situations when there's an actual conflict and Turkey has to. But I want to repeat that again, like Turkey will try to calm things down and, ensure stability in its neighborhood, including the Black Sea. Stronger NATO posture in Southeast Europe, I mentioned it, right? So supporting Ukraine's NATO membership, I think, would definitely check that box for Turkey. It's, I think there's the broader problem we've been having is, right, what is NATO's next mission, not what is NATO's purpose? In some ways, Putin's recent escalation kind of gave NATO's more purpose, and then there was more unity within NATO than I think many people expected. So that's a good thing for NATO for now. But I'm not sure if that unity could be could continue if there is an escalation in the conflict and Russia, goes into Ukraine. NATO members already said, US already said, we will support Ukraine militarily, but we are not going to defend Ukraine against Russia. That's kind of the message Russia got already. So I think Turkey is definitely, as I said, also Turkey, mentioned NATO requirements several times over the past several weeks. So Turkey will abide by those and will work with NATO allies. supporting both Ukraine and Georgia's membership, I think, answers that question that Turkey is definitely interested in strengthening the alliance in Southeast Europe.
And Jeff, there is a question. Do you expect any retuning of U.S. policy towards Turkey, especially in regards to S-400s and other things after the crisis?
Yeah, I don't expect a dramatic change on that front, no. That said, with the departure of Turkey from the F-35 program over the purchase of the S-400s, there's been a push to give it access to F-16s and the ability to modernize US-built F-16s. That effort has faced some resistance, but I think that with the greater appreciation for the role that Turkey is playing, I'm cautiously optimistic that we'll see more movement on that front. So not sort of resolving the S-400 issue per se, which I imagine there are other complications in terms of how that affects the Russo-Turkish relationship, and there are various reasons that Turkey's not able to simply walk away from it, but that there will be a more concerted effort within the United States to try and contain the political fallout of that, even after Turkey was removed from the F-35 program.
Jeff, there is another, since it's not directly mentioned your name, but directed to you, but since you mentioned Idlib, there is a question. Hisham Al-Nachawati is asking, if Russian invasion occurred, would we see fighting back from adversaries in Syria? And what would Turkey do? Would we see Turkish forces involved?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand the question. Could you?
If Russian invasion occurred, would we see fighting back from adversaries in Syria?
Oh, if Russia invades Ukraine, would there be? Okay, I got it. I certainly think.
Would we see Turkish forces involved?
I certainly think that that's a possibility. Idlib remains a focal point for the confrontation in Syria and a source of instability. It's a place where Russia and its allies have the ability to put pressure on Turkey. I think there are various reasons for keeping Idlib under the current regime that exists there. But one of the things that I think is important to keep in mind is that for Russia, what happens in Ukraine is vastly more important than what happens in Syria. And that if there's a need to put pressure on Turkey, they can do. Idlib gives them a good opportunity to do that, even if it means sort of creating additional complications and potentially changing the status quo. I think that at the end of the day, Russia wants to keep that possibility alive, and it wants Turkey to know that that possibility is alive as a form of deterrence should Turkey decide to do anything in Ukraine that Russia would regard as crossing its red lines.
Yevgenia, there's a question on energy. Please elaborate on the energy issue in the region. What energy dependencies are at work? Does Turkey still get substantial energy from Russia as well as Azerbaijan? If so, how might that shape Turkey's options?
Very relevant question, given that gas issues are always here on the agenda, and the energy issues are basically instruments of the hybrid warfare and of this geopolitical balancing rather than of economic market as it should have been. But for Ukraine, that is always, and that always used to be a problem, as well as for Turkey, because we had this dependency on Russian gas, huge one. Remember the crisis of 2008, 2009, for example, when we still had our Western pipeline, which was bringing Russian gas via Ukraine to Turkey. And then again, as a part of this blackmailing and so on, Russian politics, there were cuts, and it was a very, very cold winter. So not to let Istanbul actually be frozen in the middle of that winter, Ukraine was pumping it in the pipeline, its technical gas, to keep gas flowing and actually to bring that gas to Istanbul. So in terms of how Russia can use gas as an instrument of pressure, of political pressure, we're very well aware of that. If you remember what happened in Moldova, for example, a couple of months ago, again, this huge gas crisis when Russia actually artificially creates that crisis in order to manipulate and to put pressure on the countries with whom foreign policies Russia does not agree, let's put it that way. So you can get the general picture and the general attitude of that. For Ukraine, well, now we have been in search for alternative sources of energy for many years. So for quite a long period of time, we've not been buying Russian gas from Russia. We had reverse from Slovakia. We had alternative tracks. So basically, we tried to diversify it. In the case of Turkey, to the best of my knowledge, and please correct me if I'm wrong, because I believe that Kadir or Kılıç might be better aware of that. I believe now it's something like 40-something% still dependent. I mean, it used to be a bit higher, then a bit lower. Then given problems with gas from Iran, it might have increased again. But still, that's quite a huge percentage of imports, which is important not for re-export even, but for the demands and for the needs of the internal market in Turkey. So that's why we supported a lot TANAP project, for example, because that was not an alternative pipeline. Like, for example, there was a Blue Stream, and then there was a Turk Stream coming into being as alternative pipeline, but still it was using the same Russian gas. On the contrary, for example, the TANAP pipeline, which brings Azerbaijan gas, helps a lot in this regard. And then it's also about LNG. So let's not forget that there are all different kinds of things which are now on the agenda being discussed. So it's still a huge dependency, but there are searches for alternative ways how to diversify the energy resources coming. Still, I would say that this dependency is quite important, and we can still feel it a lot. How Russia can use it vis-a-vis Turkey, I think that, well, it can try to use it, not only, by the way, the Turk Stream, but also the Akkuyu NPP, which is now built by Rosatom, but it works both ways. So it's not only Turkish imports of Russian gas, but also Russian exports to Turkey of Russian gas. So here, I think that since Turkish market is quite a huge one for Russia, there are certain limits to how far Russia can go in its blackmailing and using these gas factoring relations with Turkey. So until it's possible, I believe Moscow will try not to use that, but still the dependency is still big, and that's why we've been always saying, even when I worked a couple of years ago in Turkey, I heard that a lot, and I talked about this a lot, that any energy project with Russia is a geopolitical project. Even if it's not now the case, it will be in the future once there is a confrontation with Russia. So I would still claim and argue that that's really something that can be used against Turkey, against Ukraine, against Moldova, European countries, because this is how Russian diplomacy and Russian hybrid diplomacy works for many years.
Thank you very much. And I want to go back to Kadir to respond to energy dependency question. And also Albert Golson is asking, Turkey is highly dependent on wheat exports from Russia and Ukraine, especially after a severe drought in 2021. How is Turkey walking the tightrope between Russia and Ukraine in order to guarantee its food security needs, regardless how the crisis plays out?
On the energy front, I think the framework Yevgenia presented is largely correct, but I would add that there's quite a bit of dependency on Russian gas, but there's also a lot of diversity in Turkey's mix. And there's a recognition and push for that diversity in recent years. Some of them Yevgenia mentioned, Azeri gas, Qatar, Libya, Iraq, Iran. Turkey Turkey's overall energy dependency is somewhere close to, I believe, 70% or 65%, both oil and gas. So that's high dependency, but there is some diversity within that. And as Evgenia mentioned, if Russia tries to use that weapon against Turkey, that's a bit of a bridge too far. And the Russians have used that towards Europe in the past, but in this recent crisis, we've seen it can backfire. Of course, indirectly, it again impacts Turkey because the natural gas prices in the international markets go up, and that makes things more expensive for everyone, especially for countries that are dependent on energy. But I don't foresee Russia using that against Turkey anytime soon, unless, of course, there's a conflict and there's a common front against Russia, and then things go really sour. Then, Russia can play that game of maybe hurting Turkey in Syria through gas, etc. But I don't think we are there yet. That's part of the reason why Turkey is pushing for some sort of settlement and offering to mediate. I'm less familiar about the specific exports and imports on agricultural products. We do know, Russia imports a lot of, Turkey imports quite a bit of Russian and Ukrainian agricultural products. I don't know the volume, I don't know the percentages, but I think this broader picture of trying to have good, strong relations with both countries, while at the same time, geopolitically, you're competing with Russia on multiple fronts. That dynamic continues, but trade relations are strong, both with Russia and Ukraine. And the summer season is coming. Tourism, Turkey is dependent on a lot of tourists coming from especially Russia, but also Ukraine. I believe 2 million tourists from Ukraine, something like that. So those are important dynamics. But I mean, food security, I'm not sure if it's such an urgent concern right now, although, food prices are increasing everywhere around the world because of the pandemic and supply chain issues, etc. So there's other factors there as well.
Thank you very much. And there is a final question that I want to ask to all of our panelists, one by one. Robert Friedman is asking, Jeff, let's start with you. How serious is the chance of a Russian-Turkish clash over Ukraine?
Yeah, I don't think it's especially high. I think the threat of a clash is really between Russia and Ukraine. And if it comes to that, Turkey is going to find itself in a very difficult position. As we've been talking about, all of us over the course of this panel, Turkey's tried to pursue a kind of middle course within this environment, developing economic and political relationships with both Moscow and Kyiv. And in doing that has positioned itself as a kind of go-between, has developed economic ties that have been beneficial, and has inserted itself into the political balance in a way that has enhanced its own strategic autonomy and helped NATO, again, play a more effective role in this situation. That said, if things descend into a real conflict, then Turkey is going to find itself having to choose. It's going to face pressure in various areas, and we talked about Idlib, we talked about the energy front, we talked about the Black Sea. All of these are areas where Turkey benefits from a status quo in which it can maintain cooperation with both sides, and where there's not large-scale instability around its borders. But if there is a conflict, if there's fighting, that is going to have a negative impact on Turkey's economy. If there's a serious conflict in Ukraine and there are refugees, that could impact Turkey's borders. It could, create a whole larger set of problems, and it could increase the sense of vulnerability in Turkey. I don't think that Russia is interested in getting into a conflict with Turkey at the same time that it's involved in what may prove to be a significant conflict with Ukraine. Of course, if this turns into a larger war involving NATO, then of course all bets are off. But I don't think that that's the intention. I think that ultimately what Russia is seeking to do is to step up the pressure to get concessions. I think it's trying to force NATO to walk back its cooperation and its commitment to Ukraine, and to rewrite some of the basic rules of the European security architecture as it emerged after the Cold War, whether that's going back to the lines that existed in 1997 or whatever it is. And, you know, the relationship with Turkey is one element of that larger plan. I don't think that the intention is to confront Turkey directly. I don't think it's to get into a conflict. And that's why the Russian response to President Erdogan's offer of mediation has been, they've at least kept the door open, if having not accepted it. I think the danger really is that a deterioration of the security environment around Turkey's borders is going to have negative implications for Turkey's economic stability and for its security.
Kadir, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't expect a major confrontation between Turkey and Russia unless things get really hot, and then NATO, you know, creates a common front. But I think that's the core problem here. NATO has had difficulty in coming together at the diplomatic level. Past several weeks, they more or less came together, but even President Biden expressed some doubts about what could happen if there was invasion within the alliance. You know, there would be serious disagreements, and we have seen that. And I think Putin sees that. I hope it doesn't get there, but the clash or some sort of start of a new Cold War would be between NATO and Russia, and that would definitely impact Turkey's relations with Russia, because Turkey has been expressing the conviction that it will, you know, honor its NATO commitments in this crisis. So it will not be easy to manage good relations with both countries if the conflict escalates, which is, again, going back to Turkey's activism on this front, supporting Ukraine, but also trying to get Russia to negotiate and come to an agreement.
Evgenia, we have 1 minute left. Your response.
Yeah, I basically agree on most points which were made. So I don't expect any kind of military clash with boots on the ground or on sea or whatever. But if we speak about confrontation, Turkey is in confrontation with Russia on many issues concerning Ukraine. Turkey does not recognize annexation of Crimea. Turkey helps Crimean Tatars and tries to defend their rights, which are under pressure from Russian side. Turkey supports Ukraine's NATO membership. So on each and every point, basically Turkey and Russia are in confrontation, but I do believe that Turkey will try its best and do all possible and impossible just not to get that to a point where the conflict really gets hot.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the panelists. I know that there are a set of questions that we couldn't ask, but our time is up, so we will stop here. Hopefully, we will continue to have this discussion, and hopefully the crisis will end, of course. We hope to see you in our next panel at SETA DC. Thank you very much.
Thank you.